The Spanish Conquest. Beginning in the 15th century, the Spanish monarchy commissioned explorers to discover a faster trade route to Asia. What these conquistadors found instead was a vast continent previously unknown to Europe and inhabited by thousands of different indigenous groups and cultures. In the 1490s, the Spanish set up a small colony called Santo Domingo on an island in the Caribbean and enslaved the indigenous population to work on farms and in gold mines. Santo Domingo was not only provided Spain with resources and wealth, but also was a convenient location for further exploration of the region. A labor shortage caused the Spanish to explore the Mexican coast. Most of the Caribbean's indigenous population had died from European diseases. Diego Velázquez de Cuellos, governor of Santo Domingo, sent the first Spanish expedition to Mexico in 1517 to find more slaves. Landing along the Yucatan coastline, the Spanish glimpsed sophisticated cities and civilizations before being fiercely driven away by the Mayas. The commander of the second trip, which sailed from Cuba in 1518, traveled further up the coastline. This was the first time the Aztecs had direct contact with the Spanish. When the Aztec emperor Montezuma heard about the Spanish, he and his advisors decided to wait and see what the Spanish would do before taking any action. What advantages did the Spanish have over the Aztecs? Cortés led a third expedition to Mexico in early 1519. From the beginning, Cortés set his sights on the Aztec Empire, the most powerful empire in all of Mexico and Central America. One of the greatest advantages of the Spanish in Mexico was that they had some idea of what to expect upon arrival. Cortés himself had 15 years of experience with indigenous Americans by the time he sailed to Mexico. The Aztecs and their emperor Montezuma, on the other hand, were unsure of what to make of the large ships, horses, body armor, and European weapons of the Spanish, and for many months they did not know what Cortés and his men intended to do. Aztec rule over conquered groups was based on demonstrations of power, such as human sacrifice, and by demanding tribute by force, rather than ruling over city-states directly. Aside from paying tribute, these city-states generally ruled themselves independently. The arrival of the Spanish altered the balance of power within the empire and called into question the supremacy of Montezuma. Many of the conquered groups had been unhappy with Aztec power, and through a combination of coercion and force, Cortés convinced many to join him against the Aztec Empire. At the same time, Cortés maintained a weak alliance with the Aztecs in order to delay fighting until he was ready. What happened in the fight for Tenochtitlan? The Spanish and their allies entered the city of Tenochtitlan for the first time in November 1519. The Spanish were awestruck by Tenochtitlan's size and grandeur. Most of them had never seen a city this large, not only in the region, but in Europe as well. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway going towards Mexico, we were amazed. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. Bernal Diaz de Castillo, one of Cortez's soldiers. Montezuma, still unsure of Spanish intentions, welcomed Cortez and his men into the city. Tenochtitlan was an island city, connected to the mainland by 3 removable bridges. Cortez, fearing a possible trap, captured Montezuma. For the next 8 months, the Spanish directed Montezuma's rule and demanded large gifts of Aztec gold. Historians are not sure why Montezuma allowed this to happen, but some believe he may have been worried about losing support if he admitted he had made the mistake in allowing the Spanish to enter the city. Spanish rule in Tenochtitlan abruptly ended in 1520 after the Spanish brutally massacred between 8,000 and 10,000 Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The Aztec populace rose up in anger, and the Spanish, suffering many casualties, were forced to flee the city. Oh, what a fight, and what a fierce battle it was that took place. It was a memorable thing to see us all streaming with blood and covered with wounds and others slain. Bernal Diaz de Castillo, one of Cortez's soldiers, remembering the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan. This was a major Aztec victory and significantly undermined support for the Spanish among other indigenous city-states. The Spanish spent the next year reforming alliances with these groups, making plans to surround Tenochtitlan and squeeze it from the outside. At the same time, the cohesion of the Aztec Empire continued to unravel after the death of Montezuma, who was killed during the uprising. Also during this period, a smallpox outbreak killed nearly 40% of the indigenous population in less than a year. The Spanish and their allies returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521. They blocked the city's 3 bridges and used ships to try to cut the city's supply of food and water. A massive battle for Tenochtitlan lasted 3 months. The Aztecs were militarily superior and had huge numbers of troops. The Spanish would have been brutally defeated had it not been for their indigenous allies, who gave supplies and tens of thousands of warriors to fight the Aztecs. There were more than 200 indigenous warriors for each Spanish fighter. The blockade of supplies and troop reinforcements eventually wore down Aztec resistance, and in August 1521, Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish and their allies. Colonial Mexico. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the remainder of the Aztec Empire quickly collapsed. The Spanish destroyed the city and built Mexico City upon its ruins. Fueled mainly by desires for riches and further exploration, the Spanish extended their rule throughout the region. But although Spain officially established its colony, New Spain, in 1535, frontier wars and indigenous resistance slowed Spanish expansion throughout the colonial period. Nevertheless, by the 1670s, New Spain was the richest and most populous Spanish colony. Of all of Spain's colonies, including much of North America, South America, and the Caribbean, Mexico was the jewel in the Spanish crown. How was Mexican society changed by colonization? A new society was created from a mix of diverse cultures in colonial Mexico. European customs blended with indigenous practices and the traditions of enslaved Africans who were brought to Mexico from Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. This created new musical styles, dances, and cultural and religious practices. People's daily lives also changed. For instance, many indigenous people who lost their land moved to the city and adapted Spanish customs. Similarly, large landowners isolated in rural areas often adapted some indigenous practices. Intermarriages and unions between men and women of different backgrounds created new racial categories. Collectively called mestizos, these groups quickly outnumbered the white population. The population also changed in other, more tragic ways. A series of plagues throughout the 16th century decimated the indigenous population. Numbering more than 12 million, at the end of the 15th century, the indigenous population was less than 1 million by 1620. Social and economic opportunities in New Spain were based on one's race and background. For example, although whites held a higher status than any other group, whites born in Spain, called peninsulares, generally had more opportunities than criollos, the whites born in the colony. Indigenous people and freed Africans, on the other hand, had very few opportunities for social or economic advancement. Slaves, of course, had no opportunities. How did the Spanish treat indigenous groups? The Spanish considered indigenous people legal minors and wards of the crown and the Catholic Church. Spanish authorities declared slavery of indigenous peoples illegal in 1542. Still, the colonial government often forced indigenous communities to pay a regular tribute, like a tax, usually of money or labor. At the same time, the colonial government protected certain indigenous rights. Most significantly, the government preserved indigenous land ownership rights. Many times, groups were forced off traditional lands, but this law allowed them to claim new lands on which to settle. Although the law was passed mainly to ensure the indigenous communities could afford to pay tribute, it allowed many communities to remain economically self-sufficient. Spanish authority was strongest in the cities, which were mainly located in central and southern Mexico. In the rural areas, particularly to the north, indigenous groups remained more independent. Revolts in the north were successful in either slowing Spanish expansion or stopping it altogether for much of the colonial period. Only the discovery of gold and silver mines led to more permanent Spanish settlements in the north. What was the economy of New Spain based upon? According to the Spanish crown, New Spain existed only for the economic benefit of Spain. The economy of New Spain was based on trade with Spain, exporting raw materials, and importing European manufactured goods. With few navigable rivers, transportation in New Spain was expensive and slow. This meant that only the most profitable goods, such as gold, silver, and cacao, were exported. The colonial government discouraged other economic development in New Spain in order to protect producers in Spain. Indigenous workers and African slaves provided the majority of labor in New Spain. The Spanish used these workers to excavate silver from mines in the north. Landowners also put them to work on their haciendas, large estates given to wealthy Spaniards by the Spanish crown. Early transportation in the colony was provided by indigenous porters who would physically carry goods and people to points of destination across the country. The forced labor of indigenous workers also built most of New Spain's cities and towns. The stone for many of the colony's finest churches and palaces came from indigenous temples and pyramids. What was the role of the Catholic Church in New Spain? The Catholic Church was the most influential institution in colonial Mexico. Many Spanish explorers justified their conquests by claiming they were spreading Christianity. The aim of conversion was to totally replace traditional religious practices with Catholicism.